The HOA board that placed them was gone. The harassment had stopped. Justice had been served. And I was still here in my house, on my property, living exactly the life I'd intended to live when I signed those closing papers so many months ago. That was victory enough for me. I never thought a Tuesday morning in February would end with me being sued for parking on my own property. But that's exactly what happened when Brenda Morrison decided to use my Plow truck as a brake pad for her minivan. My name is Ethan Quillen, and I own a modest 3-bedroom ranch house on Oakmont Drive in Shelbyville, Indiana. I bought the place 5 years ago, back when the neighborhood was just regular folks minding their own business. Then the HOA formed 2 years later, and everything went straight to hell. I run a small snow removal business during the winter months, which means I keep my Plow truck parked in my driveway alongside my regular pickup. Never had a problem with it until Brenda Morrison became HOA president last fall. The morning it all went down, I was inside finishing my second cup of coffee when I heard the unmistakable sound of metal crunching against metal. The crash was loud enough to rattle the windows. I dropped my mug in the sink and ran outside in my socks, not even bothering to grab shoes. The temperature was hovering around 20 degrees, and there was about 4 inches of fresh snow on the ground from the night before. What I saw made my blood pressure spike instantly. Brenda's white Honda Odyssey was wedged against the driver's side of my Plow truck, steam pouring from her crumpled hood. The impact had been hard enough to shove my truck back about 2 feet, leaving deep gouges in the asphalt of my driveway. My truck's door was completely caved in, and I could see the plow blade had been knocked askew. Brenda climbed out of her minivan, completely unscathed except for what looked like a small scratch on her forehead. She was wearing her typical outfit, a purple fleece jacket over khaki pants, with her highlighted blonde hair pulled back in a tight ponytail. She was 52 years old and had the perpetual expression of someone who had just discovered a fly in their soup. What the hell happened? I shouted, running down my front steps. The snow was freezing my feet through my socks, but I barely noticed. Brenda pointed an accusatory finger at my truck. "Your vehicle is illegally parked and creating a hazard." I stared at her, genuinely confused. "It's in my driveway, on my property." According to HOA Regulations Section 7.3, commercial vehicles are not permitted to be visible from the street, she said, pulling out her phone. She wasn't even looking at the damage to either vehicle. "I'm documenting this violation right now." "You just crashed into my truck and you're worried about HOA regulations." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "Are you hurt? Do we need to call an ambulance?" "I'm fine, no thanks to you," she snapped. "If your truck hadn't been illegally parked there, this never would have happened." I looked at the position of her van. She had clearly been turning into my driveway, probably to deliver one of her notorious HOA violation notices, and had somehow managed to accelerate instead of brake. The skid marks in the snow told the whole story. She had come in at an angle, completely out of control. "Brenda, you drove into my driveway and hit my parked truck. This is your fault. I was coming to deliver a notice about your multiple violations, and your oversized commercial vehicle blocked my path," she said, her voice getting shriller. I had to swerve, and the snow made me slide right into it. "You'll be hearing from my lawyer." My neighbor, Tom Hendricks, had come outside and was standing on his porch in his bathrobe, watching the whole scene with wide eyes. He gave me a sympathetic look. Tom had been on the receiving end of Brenda's HOA crusades before when she tried to fine him for having his trash cans visible from the street on a non-collection day. "We need to call the police and file an accident report," I said, pulling out my own phone. My feet were going numb. "Don't bother." I already called them, Brenda said. She started taking pictures of my truck from various angles, completely ignoring the damage to her own vehicle. I'm documenting everything for my insurance claim and the lawsuit. Lawsuit? Are you serious right now? Completely serious. You're going to pay for the damage to my vehicle, plus emotional distress, plus the cost of my medical evaluation. A Shelbyville Police Department cruiser pulled up about 10 minutes later. Officer Rick Patterson stepped out, a guy in his mid-30s who I recognized from the local diner. He looked at the scene, then at me standing there in my soaking wet socks, then back at the vehicles. Morning, folks. Who wants to tell me what happened here? Brenda immediately launched into her version of events, talking so fast that Officer Patterson had to ask her to slow down twice. According to her story, I had illegally parked a commercial vehicle in clear violation of HOA regulations, creating a hazardous situation. When she attempted to deliver a violation notice, the dangerous positioning of my truck caused her to lose control in the snowy conditions, resulting in an unavoidable collision. She demanded that I be cited for multiple violations and held responsible for all damages. Officer Patterson wrote everything down, his expression carefully neutral. Then he turned to me. "And your version, Mr. Quillen?" I was inside my house. My truck was parked in my driveway where it's been parked every day for the past 5 years. I heard a crash, came outside, and found her van embedded in the side of my truck. The officer walked around both vehicles, examining the damage and the tire tracks in the snow. He spent a lot of time looking at the skid marks and the angle of impact. Then he measured the distance from the street to where my truck was parked using a laser measuring tool from his cruiser. "Miss Morrison, your vehicle is entirely in Mr. Quillen's driveway," Officer Patterson said. "Can you explain why you were in his driveway?" "I was delivering an HOA notice, as is my right as president of the Oakmont Hills Homeowners Association," Brenda said. "He's been in violation of multiple regulations." "Madam, HOA business doesn't give you the right to drive onto someone's property without permission," the officer said. "And based on these skid marks, it looks like you were going pretty fast when you lost control." Brenda's face turned red. "I was going a reasonable speed. The hazardous placement of that truck is what caused this accident." Officer Patterson looked at me. "Is your truck registered and insured?" "Yes, sir. Registration and insurance are both current. I can get you the documents right now." "Please do, and maybe grab some shoes while you're at it." I ran inside, my feet screaming with relief as they hit the warm floor. I grabbed my insurance card, registration, and the folder where I kept all my business licensing documents, just in case. I also threw on some boots and a heavier coat. When I came back outside, Officer Patterson was on his radio, calling for a supervisor. That didn't seem like a good sign. Brenda was sitting in the back of the cruiser, still talking animatedly on her phone. I handed over my documents and the officer looked through them carefully. "Your Plow truck is a commercial vehicle?" he asked. "Yes, sir. I run a snow removal business, Quillen Snow Services. Been licensed for 7 years. And you park it here regularly, every day. It's never been a problem until the HOA started up." A second cruiser arrived, and Sergeant Linda Morrison stepped out. No relation to Brenda, thankfully, though the shared last name made for a confusing moment. She was a woman in her late 40s with gray streaked brown hair and a no-nonsense demeanor. Officer Patterson briefed her on the situation while I stood there freezing. Tom was still watching from his porch, now with a cup of coffee in his hand. A few other neighbors had come out too, drawn by the police presence. Sergeant Morrison looked at both vehicles, examined the skid marks, and then came over to talk to me. "Mr. Quillen, do you have any security cameras?" I do, actually. I installed them last year after someone kept leaving nasty notes on my door about my truck. I'm going to need that footage. I pulled up the security camera app on my phone. I had 3 cameras covering my property, including one that had a clear view of the driveway. I rewound to about 15 minutes before the crash and let it play. The footage was crystal clear. It showed Brenda's minivan coming down the street at what looked like normal speed. Then, instead of stopping at the street, she turned sharply into my driveway. Her van accelerated suddenly, the wheels spinning in the snow, and she plowed directly into the side of my truck. There was no swerving, no attempt to brake until the last second. She had just aimed straight at my truck and hit the gas. "Can you send me that footage?" Sergeant Morrison asked. "Absolutely." I emailed the video file to the address she provided. The sergeant went over to talk to Brenda, who was now out of the cruiser again. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Brenda's body language was getting more and more agitated. She kept pointing at my truck and waving her arms around. Sergeant Morrison remained calm, occasionally nodding or asking a question. After about 10 minutes, the sergeant came back to me. "Mr. Quillen, based on the evidence, including the video footage, it's clear that Miss Morrison was at fault for this accident. She drove onto your property and struck your legally parked vehicle. I'm going to issue her a citation for careless driving." "Thank you," I said, relief washing over me. "However, she's insisting that your truck is illegally parked according to HOA regulations. Do you know anything about that?" I pulled out another document from my folder. "I do. When the HOA sent me a violation notice last month about my truck, I had my lawyer look into it. Turns out, the HOA regulation they're citing doesn't actually apply to my property." "How so?" "When I bought this house, the HOA didn't exist yet. The HOA was formed 2 years ago, but they can't retroactively enforce rules that restrict how I use my property unless I signed an agreement. Which I didn't. My lawyer sent them a letter explaining this, but they keep sending violation notices anyway." Sergeant Morrison took the letter from my lawyer and read through it. She made some notes on her pad. "This is really a civil matter between you and the HOA. As far as the police are concerned, you have every right to park your registered, insured vehicle on your own property." Brenda must have heard this because she came storming over. "That's not true. Every property in this neighborhood is subject to HOA regulations." "Madam, I've explained this to you already," Sergeant Morrison said. "Property rights are complex, and if there's a dispute about HOA regulations, you need to take it up in civil court. Right now, what we have is a simple accident where you drove onto Mr. Quillen's property and struck his vehicle. You're being cited for careless driving. This is ridiculous. I'm calling my lawyer right now." Brenda pulled out her phone and stomped back toward her damaged minivan. Officer Patterson arranged for a tow truck to remove Brenda's van, which was too damaged to drive. My plow truck was drivable barely, but the damage was extensive. The driver's door was completely caved in, and I'd have to climb in through the passenger side. The plow mounting system was bent, which meant the plow itself was probably unusable until I could get it repaired. I took my own photos of everything, getting shots from every angle. Tom came over once the police had finished up. "That was insane, man," he said, shaking his head. "I saw the whole thing from my kitchen window. She just gunned it right into your truck." "You'd be willing to give a statement about what you saw?" I asked. "Absolutely. Brenda's been making everyone's life miserable since she became HOA president. Last month she tried to fine me $300 because my mailbox was the wrong shade of black. Can you believe that? Wrong shade of black. I got Tom's contact information and made a note to have my lawyer reach out to him. Then I called my insurance company and started a claim. The agent I spoke with sounded weary when I explained that the at-fault driver was claiming the accident was my fault for parking on my own property. We see a lot of strange claims, but HOA-related ones are always the worst, she said. Don't worry, we'll handle it. Make sure you get us that security footage. Next, I called my business partner, Mike Chen, who helped me run the snow removal service. We had contracts with about 30 commercial properties and a dozen residential clients who needed their driveways plowed regularly. With my truck out of commission, we were going to have problems. Are you kidding me? Mike said when I explained what happened. Brenda Morrison, that's the same woman who tried to get the town to shut down my wife's home bakery business, right? That's the one. Unbelievable. Okay, I can cover your route with my truck for now, but we're going to need to rent something if this drags on. We've got that big snow storm coming this weekend. I'll figure it out. Send me the rental quote and I'll add it to my claim against her insurance. After I hung up with Mike, I went inside to change out of my wet socks and call my lawyer, Dennis Murphy. Dennis had been practicing law in Shelbyville for 20 years and had helped me set up my business initially. He was a stocky guy with a thick beard who looked more like a lumberjack than an attorney, but he was sharp as a tack. Ethan, my friend, you have the worst luck with this HOA, Dennis said when I finished explaining, but this is actually good for us. Good. My truck is totaled and I'm going to lose business. Good because she escalated from being annoying to actually causing real, documented damage, and she did it while trespassing on your property. When she sues you, which she will, we're going to counterclaim for everything. The truck damage, lost business income, harassment, the whole thing. You really think she'll sue? Oh, absolutely. People like Brenda don't back down. She's convinced she's right and she'll throw money at lawyers to prove it. Did you get the police report number? I gave him all the information, including the report number and Sergeant Morrison's contact information. Dennis said he'd get a copy of the official report and start preparing our defense and counterclaim. The rest of that day was a nightmare of phone calls and logistics. My insurance company confirmed they'd cover the repairs to my truck minus my deductible, and they'd pursue Brenda's insurance for reimbursement. The body shop estimated it would take at least 3 weeks to fix the truck, maybe longer depending on parts availability. I ended up renting a Plow truck at $300 a day, which was going to eat into my profit margins fast. By evening, I was exhausted. I heated up some leftover pizza and sat down on my couch, finally able to process everything that had happened. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. Just got a visit from Brenda. She wanted me to change my statement and say I didn't see what happened. I told her no way. Thought you should know. I texted back my thanks and made a note to tell Dennis about it. Witness tampering wasn't going to look good for Brenda if this went to court. The next morning, I found an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was a formal notice from the Oakmont Hills Homeowners Association, signed by Brenda Morrison. It informed me that I was being fined $500 for parking a commercial vehicle in violation of HOA regulations, an additional $300 for creating a safety hazard, and $100 per day that the violation continued. Furthermore, the HOA was demanding that I remove the Plow truck from my property within 72 hours or face additional penalties. I took photos of the notice and emailed them to Dennis immediately. He called me back within an hour. "This is golden," he said. "She's doubling down after causing an accident on your property. This shows a pattern of harassment. Keep that notice safe. What do I do about the fines? Ignore them. Don't pay a penny. They have no legal authority to fine you, and any attempt to collect will just strengthen our case." 2 weeks went by. My truck was still in the shop, and I was bleeding money on the rental. The storm Mike had mentioned turned out to be a major blizzard, dropping 14 inches of snow across central Indiana. We worked around the clock for 3 days straight, and while the income was good, I couldn't stop thinking about how much more it would have been if I wasn't paying for the rental. Brenda continued her campaign. I received another HOA notice, this time upping the fine to $2,000. She also sent a letter to all the neighbors claiming that my illegal commercial vehicle had caused an accident that endangered the entire neighborhood and urging them to support the HOA's enforcement actions. Tom forwarded me the letter. "She's completely lost it," he wrote. "Half the neighborhood thinks she's crazy. The other half is scared she'll come after them next." Then, on a Thursday afternoon in early March, I got served. A process server showed up at my door with a thick manila envelope. Brenda Morrison was suing me for $50,000. According to the complaint, I had negligently and recklessly parked a commercial vehicle in violation of clearly stated HOA regulations, creating a hazardous condition. This hazardous condition had directly caused an accident in which Brenda suffered physical injuries, emotional distress, and property damage. She was seeking compensation for her medical bills, vehicle repairs, pain and suffering, and punitive damages for my willful disregard of safety regulations. I sat at my kitchen table reading through the complaint, feeling my anger build with each page. The whole thing was a fantasy. She was claiming whiplash, a concussion, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. She said her vehicle was totaled and worth $30,000, which was absurd for a 5-year-old Honda Odyssey with 100,000 miles on it. She even claimed that I had been lying in wait to cause an accident, knowing that she would need to access my driveway to deliver HOA notices. I called Dennis immediately and read him the complaint over the phone. "Okay, don't panic. This is actually pretty standard for this type of case. She's throwing everything at the wall to see what sticks," he said. "We'll file our answer and our counterclaim. Do you want to go after her personally, or the HOA, or both?" "Both. If the HOA wants to back her play, they can pay for it too." "That's what I like to hear. I'll have the paperwork drawn up by next week." Our counterclaim was a thing of beauty. Dennis sued Brenda personally and the Oakmont Hills Homeowners Association for trespass, property damage, harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, lost business income, and abuse of process. We asked for $75,000 in damages plus attorney's fees. The counterclaim detailed every HOA violation notice I'd received, every threatening letter, every fine notice. It included the security camera footage showing Brenda deliberately driving into my driveway and striking my truck. It had statements from Tom and 2 other neighbors about Brenda's harassment campaigns. It even included documentation about how the HOA regulations didn't legally apply to my property. When Brenda got served with the counterclaim, she apparently had a meltdown at the HOA meeting. Tom attended and reported back to me. According to him, Brenda had stood up in front of the 20 or so homeowners who attended and ranted for 45 minutes about how I was destroying the neighborhood. She claimed I was trying to bankrupt the HOA and ruin property values for everyone. One of the other homeowners, a retired attorney named Gerald Schwartz, stood up and asked to see the HOA's insurance policy. Brenda had refused, saying it was confidential. Gerald pointed out that, as a dues-paying member, he had a right to review the HOA's financial documents. That led to an argument that apparently got pretty heated before the meeting broke up early. The next day, Gerald called me. I'd never spoken to him before, though I knew who he was. "Mr. Quillen, I hope you don't mind me reaching out," he said. "I've been reviewing the HOA's bylaws and financial records, which I finally got Brenda to hand over after threatening to file a complaint with the state. I think you should know that the HOA's insurance policy specifically excludes coverage for officers who act outside the scope of their authority." "What does that mean for this lawsuit?" "It means if a court finds that Brenda was acting improperly when she drove onto your property, the HOA's insurance won't cover the judgment. The HOA itself would be on the hook for any damages. That's our money, mine and all the other homeowners. I'm going to call an emergency meeting to have her removed as president." "I appreciate the heads up, Mr. Schwartz. Call me Gerald. And for what it's worth, a lot of us think Brenda's been out of control for a while now. This lawsuit is just the last straw." 3 days later, there was an emergency HOA meeting. Tom texted me updates throughout. Gerald had rallied enough homeowners to call for a vote of no confidence in Brenda's leadership. The vote was 23-7 to remove her as president, with 12 homeowners abstaining. Brenda had shouted that they were all making a huge mistake and stormed out before the meeting was even over. The new interim president was a woman named Patricia Chen, Mike's wife, and the same person who ran the home bakery Brenda had tried to shut down. Patricia immediately hired a lawyer to review the lawsuit and the HOA's potential liability. Their lawyer sent a letter to Dennis requesting mediation to resolve the matter before it went to trial. Brenda, on the other hand, was charging full steam ahead. Her lawyer filed a motion for summary judgment, arguing that the case was so clear-cut that it didn't even need to go to trial. According to their argument, I had violated HOA regulations and created a hazardous condition, and that was the sole cause of the accident. They wanted the judge to rule in their favor immediately and award them the full $50,000. Dennis filed a response that methodically destroyed every argument they made. He attached the security camera footage, the police report, statements from witnesses, and most importantly, the legal analysis showing that the HOA regulations didn't apply to my property. He also pointed out that even if the regulations did apply, they wouldn't override my right to park a legally registered vehicle on my own property, and they certainly wouldn't justify Brenda trespassing and causing property damage. The hearing on the motion for summary judgment was scheduled for late April. In the meantime, my truck finally came back from the body shop. The repairs had cost $18,000, every penny of which my insurance company was now pursuing from Brenda's insurer. I got back to work with my own truck, grateful to stop hemorrhaging money on the rental. Business was actually picking up. Several of my clients mentioned that they'd heard about the lawsuit and thought Brenda was crazy. Word had spread through Shelbyville's small business community, and I got 3 new commercial contracts from people who wanted to support me. Mike joked that getting sued might be the best advertising we'd ever done. The day of the hearing arrived. Dennis told me I didn't need to attend since it was just a motion hearing, but I wanted to be there. The Shelby County Courthouse was a beautiful old building in downtown Shelbyville, all red brick and white columns. I met Dennis outside, and we went through security together. Brenda was already in the courtroom with her attorney, a slick-looking guy in his 30s named Chad Wilkinson. Chad had slicked back hair and an expensive suit, the kind of lawyer who probably did personal injury cases exclusively. Brenda was dressed like she was going to church, in a conservative navy blue dress and pearls. She glared at me when I walked in. The Honorable Judge Margaret Thornton came out promptly at 9, and everyone stood. Judge Thornton was a black woman in her 60s who had a reputation for not tolerating nonsense in her courtroom. She'd been on the bench for over 20 years. "Good morning. We're here on the motion for summary judgment filed by the plaintiff, Brenda Morrison. Mr. Wilkinson, you may proceed. Chad stood up and launched into his argument. He spent 15 minutes talking about how HOA regulations were enforceable contracts, how commercial vehicles created hazards in residential neighborhoods, and how I had willfully and recklessly violated these regulations. He claimed that the accident was a foreseeable result of my negligence, and that the security footage actually supported their case, because it showed how my truck was lying in ambush in the driveway. Judge Thornton interrupted him. "Counselor, are you seriously arguing that a truck parked in a driveway is lying in ambush?" "Your Honor, the truck was positioned in such a way that it created an unavoidable hazard for anyone attempting to access the property." "Wouldn't the solution be to not access someone else's property without permission?" Chad fumbled for a moment. "Your Honor, as HOA president, Miss Morrison had a right and duty to access the property to deliver violation notices." "Does the HOA have an easement or any other legal right to access Mr. Quillen's driveway?" "Well, not a formal easement, but the HOA regulations allow for property inspections and notice delivery." "And did Mr. Quillen sign an agreement subjecting his property to these regulations?" Chad hesitated. "The regulations apply to all properties in the neighborhood." "That's not what I asked. Did Mr. Quillen sign an agreement?" "No, Your Honor, but the regulations were properly filed and noticed." "After he already owned the property, correct?" "Yes, Your Honor." Judge Thornton made a note. "Continue." Chad tried to recover, arguing that even if the HOA regulations were questionable, I still had a duty to park my truck safely, and that the accident was caused by my negligence. He showed the court some photos of my truck in the driveway, trying to make it look like it was jutting out dangerously into the street. The photos were taken from misleading angles that made the truck look bigger and more intrusive than it really was. When Chad finally sat down, Judge Thornton turned to Dennis. "Mr. Murphy," Dennis stood up, and I could tell he was in his element. He started by playing the security camera footage on the courtroom's display system. The video showed exactly what happened in clear, undeniable detail. Brenda's van turning into my driveway, accelerating and slamming into my truck. "Your Honor, this is not a case about HOA regulations or property rights, although we will address those issues at trial. This is a case about a simple rear-end collision, or more accurately, a side impact collision. The plaintiff drove onto my client's property and struck his legally parked vehicle. The police determined she was at fault and issued her a citation for careless driving. Everything else is an attempt to distract from those basic facts." Dennis then went through the legal issues one by one. He explained how the HOA regulations didn't apply to my property because I'd bought it before the HOA existed and never agreed to be bound by their rules. He cited Indiana case law about retroactive application of HOA covenants. He explained how, even if the regulations did apply, they couldn't override my property rights or justify someone else causing damage to my property. Furthermore, Your Honor, the plaintiff's claim that my client created a hazard is contradicted by the fact that his truck has been parked in the same location for 5 years without incident. The only hazard present on the morning of the accident was the plaintiff driving recklessly onto someone else's property. The police report, the physical evidence, and the video footage all support this conclusion. Dennis then addressed the damages Brenda was claiming. The plaintiff alleges she suffered a concussion, whiplash, and severe emotional distress. However, the police report notes that she refused medical attention at the scene. Her medical records, which we obtained through discovery, show that she didn't seek treatment until 3 days after the accident, and even then, her doctor found only minor soft tissue strain. There is no evidence of a concussion. There is no evidence of any significant injury. What we have is a plaintiff who is exaggerating her injuries to support an outrageous damage claim. Judge Thornton was nodding as Dennis spoke. When he finished and sat down, she looked at both lawyers. I'm going to deny the motion for summary judgment. This case will proceed to trial. However, I'm going to say for the record that the plaintiff's case appears weak. The video evidence is quite clear, and the plaintiff's legal theories about HOA regulations and parking hazards are not compelling. Mr. Wilkinson, you may want to discuss settlement with your client. This court is adjourned. We all stood as Judge Thornton left the courtroom. Brenda looked furious. She started to say something to me as we filed out, but Chad put his hand on her arm and shook his head. Dennis and I walked out of the courthouse into the spring sunshine. That went about as well as we could have hoped, Dennis said. The judge basically told them their case is garbage. So what happens now? Now we wait for them to either settle or prepare for trial. My guess is Wilkinson will try to convince Brenda to drop the case, but she's stubborn. We might actually end up in front of a jury. That evening, I got a call from Patricia Chen, the new HOA president. Ethan, I wanted to let you know that the HOA board met this afternoon, and we've voted to settle our portion of the lawsuit. We're withdrawing from the case, and we'll pay for the rental truck costs you incurred. We'll also be rescinding all the fines and violation notices Brenda issued to you. That's great news, Patricia. Thank you. I also want to apologize on behalf of the HOA. What Brenda did was wrong, and she never had the authority to harass you the way she did. We're actually considering amending our bylaws to clarify that the regulations only apply to properties that explicitly agreed to them. I appreciate that, and congratulations on becoming president. Thanks. Hopefully, I can do a better job than my predecessor. With the HOA out of the picture, Brenda was on her own. Her insurance company had already denied her claim, finding that she was at fault for the accident. That meant any judgment against her would come out of her own pocket. Chad Wilkinson filed a motion to withdraw as her attorney a week after the hearing. The motion said there were irreconcilable differences in litigation strategy, which was lawyer speak for my client won't listen to reason, and I don't want to be part of this disaster anymore. Brenda ended up hiring a new lawyer, a solo practitioner named Dorothy Felton, who had an office above a dry cleaner on the outskirts of town. Dennis knew her and said she was competent but took cases that other lawyers wouldn't touch because she needed the money. The trial was scheduled for July. As summer approached, Dennis and I spent hours preparing. We went over the evidence, practiced my testimony, and planned out our strategy. The case was straightforward, but Dennis warned me that you could never predict what a jury would do. Juries don't always follow the law or the evidence, he said. Sometimes they make decisions based on emotion or sympathy. Brenda's going to try to paint herself as a victim and you as a big, scary commercial operator who doesn't care about the neighborhood. I've lived there for 5 years. I know half the neighbors personally. Good. We'll make sure the jury knows that. June flew by. My business was doing well, and I was finally recovering from the financial hit of the accident. Mike and I had landed a major contract with a new office park that would keep us busy all next winter. Life was getting back to normal, except for the looming trial. The trial began on a hot Monday in mid-July. The courtroom was packed with about 30 people from the neighborhood who had come to watch. Tom was there, along with Gerald Schwartz, Patricia Chen, and a bunch of other people I recognized from around Oakmont Drive. Brenda sat at the plaintiff's table with Dorothy Felton, looking tense, Jury selection took all day Monday and half of Tuesday. We ended up with a jury of 7 people, 4 women and 3 men, ranging in age from their 20s to their 60s. They seemed like regular folks, which was what we wanted. Dorothy Felton gave the opening statement for the plaintiff. She tried to paint me as a reckless businessman who had turned a quiet residential street into a commercial operation. She talked about how my massive Plow truck dominated the neighborhood and created a constant danger. She said Brenda had been trying to do her duty as HOA president by addressing this violation when she was forced to take evasive action and was injured in the resulting accident. Ladies and gentlemen, this case is about responsibility, Dorothy said. Mr. Quillen made a choice to prioritize his business over the safety and quality of life of his neighbors. Miss Morrison was trying to protect the neighborhood when she was injured. Now, Mr. Quillen refuses to take responsibility for the consequences of his actions. You have the power to hold him accountable. It was a decent opening, I had to admit. She was trying to reframe the case away from the simple facts of the accident and toward a broader narrative about community and responsibility. If the jury bought into that narrative, we could be in trouble. Then Dennis gave our opening statement. He was calm and matter-of-fact, walking the jury through exactly what happened that morning in February. This is a simple case, Dennis said. Miss Morrison drove onto Mr. Quillen's property and struck his parked vehicle. The police investigated and determined she was at fault. She was issued a citation for careless driving. Those are the facts, and they are not in dispute. Everything else you're going to hear from the plaintiff is an attempt to confuse you and distract you from those basic facts. Dennis clicked through a presentation on the courtroom screen, showing photos of my property, the accident scene, and finally, the security camera footage. You're going to see this video several times during this trial. I encourage you to watch it carefully. It shows exactly what happened, with no ambiguity and no room for interpretation. Miss Morrison accelerated into Mr. Quillen's driveway and crashed into his truck. That's not an evasive maneuver. That's not an unavoidable accident. That's careless driving, pure and simple. The first witness was Officer Rick Patterson. Dorothy questioned him about the accident scene and tried to get him to admit that my truck might have been difficult to see or that it could have contributed to the accident. Officer Patterson was professional and stuck to the facts. Yes, there was snow on the ground. No, visibility wasn't significantly impaired. Yes, the truck was clearly visible from the street. No, its position didn't create a hazard. When Dennis cross-examined, he asked about the skid marks and the angle of impact. Officer Patterson explained that the physical evidence showed Brenda had been driving straight into the driveway when she accelerated suddenly. There was no indication of any attempt to avoid the truck until the very last second. In your professional opinion, based on your training and experience, was Mr. Quillen's truck positioned in a way that created a hazard? Dennis asked. No. The truck was completely in his driveway about 15 feet from the street. There was nothing hazardous about its position. And in your professional opinion, who was at fault for this accident? Miss Morrison was at fault. She was driving carelessly and struck a parked vehicle. Next up was the collision reconstruction expert Dorothy had hired, a guy named Stephen Warner who had testified in dozens of accident cases. He had diagrams and charts showing sight lines and reaction times. He tried to argue that my truck's position created a blind spot that made the accident difficult for Brenda to avoid. Dennis tore him apart on cross-examination. He pointed out that Stephen hadn't visited the accident scene until 3 months after the accident, when the snow was long gone and the lighting conditions were completely different. He got Stephen to admit that his analysis hadn't taken into account the security camera footage showing Brenda accelerating into the driveway. By the time Dennis was done, Stephen looked flustered and his testimony looked unreliable. The first day of testimony ended around 4 in the afternoon. Judge Thornton dismissed the jury with instructions not to discuss the case or do any outside research. Dennis and I went back to his office to debrief. "That went well," Dennis said. "Their expert wasn't as strong as I expected. How are you holding up?" "I'm okay. It's surreal watching people argue about something I saw with my own eyes." "That's trials for you. Tomorrow they'll put Brenda on the stand. That's going to be the key moment." Wednesday morning, Dorothy called Brenda to testify. Brenda had clearly been coached on how to present herself. She spoke softly and dabbed at her eyes with a tissue when talking about how scared she was during the accident. She described the massive commercial vehicle that loomed over the neighborhood and made everyone feel unsafe. "I was just trying to do my job as HOA president," Brenda said. "I had received so many complaints from neighbors about that truck. They were afraid. They worried about their property values. I had a duty to address it." Dorothy walked her through the accident itself. According to Brenda's testimony, she had been driving carefully down the street when she decided to deliver the violation notice. "As she turned into my driveway, she suddenly saw my truck lunging out at her. She panicked and hit the gas instead of the brake, causing her to crash. The accident had given her terrible anxiety, nightmares, and chronic neck pain. It was a good performance, I had to admit. If I hadn't seen the security footage, I might have believed her. But she was lying, and the video would prove it. Dennis's cross-examination was devastating. He started by asking about the HOA violations. "Miss Morrison, you testified that you received many complaints about Mr. Quillen's truck. How many complaints did you receive?" Brenda hesitated. "I don't have an exact number. More than 10, I believe so. More than 5. Yes." "Can you name one person who complained?" "Well, they were often anonymous. So you don't actually know if anyone complained, do you?" "People told me they were concerned." Dennis pulled out a document. "This is a survey the new HOA board conducted of all homeowners in the neighborhood. It asked specifically whether residents had concerns about Mr. Quillen's truck. Of the 42 homeowners who responded, only 3 said they had any concerns. Were you aware of this survey?" "No." "So your testimony about receiving many complaints appears to have been exaggerated, doesn't it?" Dorothy objected, but Judge Thornton overruled it. Brenda looked flustered. Dennis then moved on to the accident itself. He played the security footage for the jury again, pausing it at key moments. "Miss Morrison, you testified that you saw the truck lunging out at you. Can you point to the moment in this video where the truck moves? It's not about the truck moving, it's about how it was positioned. The truck is parked. It's not moving. You can see it clearly as you approach, can't you?" "I suppose so." "In fact, you can see the truck from at least 50 feet away in this video, correct?" "I don't know the exact distance." "You turned into the driveway. That was a deliberate action, wasn't it?" "I was trying to deliver the notice." "And then you accelerated." "We can see your van suddenly move forward faster. Why did you accelerate?" "I didn't mean to. I panicked." "You panicked because you saw the truck that had been parked in that exact spot every single day for 5 years. It startled me." "Miss Morrison, isn't it true that you were angry at Mr. Quillen for ignoring your HOA notices?" "I was frustrated, yes." "Isn't it true that you deliberately drove into his driveway intending to confront him about his truck?" "I was delivering a notice." "Isn't it true that you accelerated toward his truck because you were angry and not paying attention to what you were doing?" "No, that's not true." Dennis let the denial hang in the air for a moment. Then he said, "No further questions." The cross-examination had taken about 45 minutes and Brenda looked shaken when she stepped down. Dorothy tried to rehabilitate her on redirect, but the damage was done. After lunch, Dorothy called Brenda's doctor, a general practitioner named Dr. Ellen Vasquez. Dr. Vasquez testified that she had treated Brenda 3 days after the accident for neck pain and headaches. She had diagnosed soft tissue strain and prescribed pain medication and physical therapy. On cross-examination, Dennis got Dr. Vasquez to admit that soft tissue strain was a very common injury that usually resolved within a few weeks. He also got her to confirm that Brenda hadn't complained of any pain or injury at her regular checkup 2 months after the accident. So as of 2 months after this accident, Miss Morrison had no ongoing symptoms or complaints, Dennis asked. That's correct based on my notes. And you didn't recommend any further treatment at that time? No. Dorothy rested the plaintiff's case around 3 in the afternoon. Judge Thornton called a 15-minute recess, and then it was our turn. Dennis called me as the first witness. I was nervous, but I'd practiced my testimony so many times that it came out naturally. I explained how I'd lived in the neighborhood for 5 years, how I'd run my snow removal business, and how my truck had been parked in the same spot every day without problems, until Brenda became HOA president. Dennis had me describe the morning of the accident, step by step. I explained how I heard the crash, ran outside and found Brenda's van smashed into my truck. I testified about how Brenda had immediately started blaming me and threatening to sue me, rather than checking if anyone was hurt or accepting responsibility. Dorothy's cross-examination tried to make me look like an inconsiderate neighbor who didn't care about the community. She asked about complaints I'd received, whether I'd ever considered parking my truck somewhere else, whether I understood that commercial vehicles lowered property values. I stayed calm and stuck to the truth. No, I hadn't received complaints from neighbors. Yes, I'd considered other parking options, but my driveway was the most practical place for my truck. No, I wasn't aware of any evidence that my truck lowered property values, and in fact, several neighbors had told me they appreciated having someone in the neighborhood who could plow their driveways during snowstorms. Next, Dennis called Tom Hendricks as a witness. Tom testified about what he'd seen from his kitchen window, which corroborated everything on the security footage. He also testified about Brenda's attempts to get him to change his statement. She came to my house the day after the accident, Tom said. She wanted me to say that I hadn't seen what happened, or that Ethan's truck was blocking my view or something. I told her I saw exactly what happened, and I wasn't going to lie about it. Dorothy tried to discredit Tom on cross-examination, suggesting he was biased because he was my friend. Tom calmly explained that he barely knew me before the accident, just a casual wave when we saw each other. He was testifying because he'd seen what happened and thought it was wrong for Brenda to lie about it. Dennis then called Gerald Schwartz, who testified about Brenda's behavior as HOA president. Gerald described how Brenda had exceeded her authority, ignored the bylaws, and tried to enforce regulations that didn't legally apply to all properties. He testified about how Brenda had refused to let homeowners review the HOA's financial records, and how she'd retaliated against people who questioned her decisions. In your opinion as an attorney and as a homeowner, was Miss Morrison acting within her authority when she drove onto Mr. Quillen's property to deliver a violation notice? Dennis asked. No, she had no legal authority to enter his property without permission, and the violation notice itself was not enforceable. Dorothy objected that Gerald wasn't qualified to give legal opinions, But Judge Thornton allowed the testimony since Gerald had identified himself as a retired attorney. Our final witness was our own expert, a retired police sergeant named Marcus Webb, who specialized in accident reconstruction. Marcus had reviewed all the evidence, including the security footage, the police report, and the physical evidence. His testimony was clear and convincing. This was a straightforward case of careless driving. Brenda had turned into the driveway, accelerated for reasons unknown, and struck a stationary vehicle. The position of my truck had nothing to do with causing the accident. Dorothy's cross-examination couldn't shake Marcus's testimony. He had 30 years of experience investigating accidents, and he'd seen thousands of cases. This one was simple. We rested our case around 4:30 in the afternoon. Judge Thornton dismissed the jury for the day and scheduled closing arguments for Thursday morning. That night, I barely slept. Dennis had warned me that even though our case was strong, juries were unpredictable. I kept playing the trial over in my head, wondering if there was something I should have said differently or some argument we should have made. Thursday morning arrived. The courtroom was even more crowded than before. Word had gotten around Shelbyville about the trial, and people were curious about the outcome. Dorothy gave her closing argument first. She tried to appeal to the jury's emotions, talking about how Brenda had been doing her civic duty and had been injured as a result. She urged the jury to send a message that business owners couldn't just ignore community standards and put their interests above their neighbors. "This case is about more than just a car accident," Dorothy said. "It's about what kind of community we want to live in. Do we want to live in a place where people respect each other and follow the rules? Or do we want to live in a place where anyone can do whatever they want without consequences?" Miss Morrison was trying to preserve the character of her neighborhood. She deserves compensation for her injuries, and she deserves justice. It was a good argument, but it didn't address the evidence. Dorothy was asking the jury to ignore the facts and make a decision based on their feelings about community and rules. Then Dennis gave our closing argument. He systematically went through the evidence, piece by piece. The security footage, the police report, the witness testimony, the expert analysis. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Brenda had caused the accident through her own careless driving. "Counsel wants you to make this case about something it's not," Dennis said. "She wants you to think about community standards and property values and business regulations. But this case is about one simple question: who caused this accident? And the answer, based on all the evidence you've heard, is Miss Morrison. She drove onto Mr. Quillen's property. She accelerated into his parked truck. She was found at fault by the police. She was issued a citation for careless driving. No amount of talking about HOA regulations or community standards can change those facts." Dennis paused and looked at each juror in turn. "Now, Miss Morrison doesn't want to accept responsibility for what she did. Instead, she's trying to blame Mr. Quillen for parking his own truck on his own property. She's asking you to award her $50,000 because she crashed into a parked vehicle. That's not justice. That's not fair. That's just trying to avoid the consequences of her own actions." He paused again. "We're asking you to find in favor of Mr. Quillen. We're asking you to reject Miss Morrison's claim and to hold her accountable for the damage she caused. And we're asking you to award Mr. Quillen the damages he deserves for having his property damaged, his business disrupted, and his life turned upside down by this lawsuit. Thank you." Judge Thornton gave the jury their instructions on the law and sent them out to deliberate around 11 in the morning. Then we waited. Jury deliberations are always nerve-wracking. You have no idea what's happening in that room, what arguments the jurors are making, or which way they're leaning. Dennis and I went to a diner across from the courthouse and tried to eat lunch, but I could barely taste the food. At 2:30, we got word that the jury had reached a verdict. We rushed back to the courthouse. The jury had been out for less than 4 hours, which Dennis said was a good sign. Long deliberations usually meant the jury was divided. A quick verdict meant they'd agreed pretty easily. Everyone filed back into the courtroom. Brenda looked pale. The jury filed in and none of them looked at Brenda, which Dennis whispered was also a good sign. Judge Thornton asked the jury foreman, a middle-aged man who worked as an accountant, if they'd reached a verdict. "We have, Your Honor." The foreman handed a paper to the bailiff, who handed it to the judge. Judge Thornton read it silently, her face neutral, then handed it back to the bailiff. "On the plaintiff's claim, how do you find?" "We find in favor of the defendant, Ethan Quillen." I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Dennis squeezed my shoulder. "On the defendant's counterclaim, how do you find?" "We find in favor of the defendant, Ethan Quillen." "And what damages do you award?" The foreman consulted his paper. "We award Mr. Quillen $18,000 for property damage, $12,000 for lost business income, and $15,000 for emotional distress and attorney's fees, for a total of $45,000. Brenda let out a small gasp. Dorothy put her hand on Brenda's arm. Judge Thornton thanked the jury for their service and dismissed them. Then she turned to the lawyers. "I'll enter judgment consistent with the verdict. Miss Felton, does your client wish to appeal?" Dorothy and Brenda had a whispered conversation. Finally, Dorothy shook her head. "No, Your Honor, we accept the verdict." "Very well. Judgment is entered for the defendant on the plaintiff's claim and for the defendant on his counterclaim in the amount of $45,000. Court is adjourned." The gavel came down and it was over. Dennis and I shook hands, and then I was surrounded by neighbors who had come to watch. Tom clapped me on the back. Gerald shook my hand. Patricia gave me a hug. Even some people I didn't know very well came up to congratulate me. Brenda left the courtroom quickly, her face flushed. Dorothy lingered to shake hands with Dennis and exchange some professional pleasantries. There were no hard feelings between the lawyers. They'd both done their jobs. Outside the courthouse, Dennis and I stood in the summer heat discussing what came next. "She has 30 days to pay the judgment," Dennis said. "If she doesn't, we can start collection proceedings. We can put a lien on her house, garnish her wages, whatever it takes." "I just want this to be over," I said. "It will be. She's not going to appeal. She knows she lost fair and square." 2 weeks later, I received a check from Brenda Morrison's attorney for $45,000. It came with no note, no apology, nothing. Just a check. I deposited it immediately, grateful to finally recover my losses and move on. Brenda resigned from the HOA entirely. Patricia told me she'd actually put her house up for sale and was moving to another town. Some people in the neighborhood felt bad for her, but most seemed relieved. The HOA under Patricia's leadership was much more reasonable. They focused on actual community issues like maintaining common areas and organizing neighborhood events, rather than harassing homeowners over petty violations. My snow removal business continued to grow. The publicity from the trial had actually helped. People liked the story of the small business owner who stood up to an out-of-control HOA. By the time winter rolled around again, I had more clients than I could handle and had to hire 2 additional employees. Tom and I became good friends. We started having beers together on Friday nights, and our families had dinner together a few times. Gerald Schwartz invited me to join the HOA board, but I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Life returned to normal, or as normal as it gets. My truck remained parked in my driveway, exactly where it had always been. No one complained. The neighborhood went on existing just fine with a commercial plow truck visible from the street. About 6 months after the trial, I ran into Brenda at the grocery store. It was awkward. We made eye contact across the produce section, and for a moment I thought she might just ignore me and walk away. Instead, she came over. "Ethan," she said quietly, "Brenda, I'm sorry for all of it. I was wrong." I was so surprised I didn't know what to say for a moment. "Thank you. I appreciate you saying that." I let the power go to my head. I thought I was doing the right thing, but I was just being controlling and petty. I've been seeing a therapist about it. "That's good. I hope it helps. I'm moving next month, fresh start somewhere else. I just wanted you to know I'm sorry before I go." Apology accepted. "Good luck with the fresh start." She nodded and walked away. I stood there holding a bag of apples, processing what had just happened. It was closure I hadn't expected but appreciated. When I got home, I parked my truck in the driveway, same as always. The sun was setting, painting the sky orange and pink. I sat in the truck for a minute, just thinking about everything that had happened. The accident, the lawsuit, the trial, the verdict. It had been a crazy year. But it was over now. Justice had been served, not just in the legal sense, but in the broader sense. Someone who had abused their power had been held accountable. Someone who refused to take responsibility had been forced to face consequences. And someone who just wanted to run their business and live their life in peace had been vindicated. I got out of the truck and walked into my house. My life was my own again. The HOA nightmare was finally over, and I could get back to what mattered: working hard, taking care of my business, and being a good neighbor to the people around me. The plow truck sat in the driveway, ready for the next snowfall. It had always been right where it belonged, and now everyone knew it. Sometimes standing your ground and fighting for what's right is exhausting and expensive, but in the end, it's worth it. You can't let people push you around just because they have a title or think they have authority over you. Property rights matter. Personal responsibility matters. And sometimes, karma comes in the form of a jury of your peers who see through the nonsense and deliver the justice that was there all along, waiting to be recognized. I never heard from Brenda again after that encounter at the grocery store. She moved away as planned, and someone nice bought her house. A young couple with a baby who actually liked that I ran a snow removal business because it meant their driveway got plowed reliably every winter. The whole experience taught me a lot about standing up for yourself, about the importance of documentation and evidence, and about how one person with too much power and too little accountability can make everyone's life miserable. It also taught me that most people are reasonable and fair when given the chance. The jury didn't know me or Brenda personally, but they looked at the evidence and made the right decision. Dennis became a good friend too. We still get together occasionally to talk about the case and laugh about some of the more ridiculous moments. He framed a copy of the jury verdict and hung it in his office as a reminder that sometimes the good guys do win. My business continued to thrive. The following winter was one of the snowiest on record, and we were slammed with work. The truck that Brenda had crashed into ended up lasting another 3 years before I finally traded it in for a newer model. I kept the old plow blade as a memento, hanging it on the wall in my garage. Every time I looked at it, I remembered that Tuesday morning in February when everything went crazy. I remembered standing in the snow in my socks, watching Brenda take pictures of my truck while claiming I was at fault. I remembered the months of stress and uncertainty, wondering if somehow the legal system would side with her despite all the evidence. But mostly, I remembered the feeling of vindication when that jury foreman read the verdict. Justice isn't always guaranteed, but when it happens, It's a beautiful thing. And sometimes you have to fight for it, even when fighting seems futile or expensive or exhausting. The neighborhood thrived under Patricia's leadership of the HOA. They actually did useful things like organizing a neighborhood watch program and getting the street repaved. People started attending HOA meetings again because they weren't just complaint sessions anymore. It became what an HOA should be: neighbors working together to improve their community, not one person on a power trip making everyone miserable. I still live in that house on Oakmont Drive. My truck still parks in the driveway. And every winter when the snow falls, I fire up that plow and take care of my clients, knowing that I earned the right to run my business the way I see fit, without interference from anyone who thinks a title makes them boss of other people's property. The whole saga became a bit of a legend in Shelbyville. People still talk about the HOA president who sued someone for parking on their own property. It's become a cautionary tale about HOAs and power, and the importance of reading the fine print before you agree to let anyone else control how you use your property. For me, it was more than just a legal battle. It was about principle. It was about refusing to be bullied or intimidated. It was about standing up for my rights even when doing so was difficult and stressful. And in the end, it was about proving that sometimes, if you have the truth on your side and you're willing to fight for it, justice will prevail. The check for $45,000 helped, of course. I used it to pay off my legal fees, replace some worn-out equipment, and put the rest in savings. But the real value wasn't in the money. It was in knowing that I'd stood my ground and won. That when someone tried to push me around using the legal system as a weapon, I pushed back and came out on top. Life goes on. Seasons change. Snow falls and gets plowed. People buy houses and sell them. HOAs form and hopefully function properly, but the lessons from that experience stuck with me. Document everything. Know your rights. Don't be afraid to stand up for yourself. And never, ever let someone make you feel like you're wrong when you know you're right. That's the story of how HOA Karen crashed her van into my plow truck and then sued me for being parked on my property. It's a story about justice, about standing your ground, and about how sometimes the person who seems to have all the power turns out to have none of it when the